Let us discuss the mammalian circulatory system. So in this lesson, we are going to discuss the following. Number one, I'm going to introduce the circulatory system, define it, and talk about its purpose in our body. Number two, a discussion on the structure of the heart, both the external structure as well as the internal structure. And lastly, circulation of blood in our body. How does blood flow in and out of the heart? Let us start. So when it comes to the circulatory system, what is it? This is simply the transporting system. So mammals are large and complex animals, and therefore they need to have an efficient system for the transport of substances around the body. And this is what the circulatory system is about. So the circulatory system has the following three main components. We have blood, we have blood vessels, and lastly and most important is the heart. So these are the components that make up the circulatory system. So when it comes to blood, blood is simply the transport fluid, the medium of transport. So anything that needs to be transported in our body is going to be present in blood. Now blood flows in blood vessels. These are tube-like structures that are found in our body. I'm talking about the arteries, the veins, and the capillaries. This is where you're going to have blood. Now mammals have a type of circulatory system that is referred to as a closed circulatory system. This is whereby you're not going to have the blood coming into direct contact with the body tissues. Now, when it comes to circulatory systems, they can be open or closed. In the case of arthropods, such as insects, they have an open circulatory system where you're going to have the transport fluid coming into contact with the body tissues. This does not happen in mammals because ours is a closed circulatory system, and it is much better because you're going to have blood being transported under very high pressures, which is going to make the whole exchange process more efficient. So this is a diagram that summarizes the components of the circulatory system. So the red fluid, of course, is blood. These tube-like structures are the blood vessels, and lastly we have the heart, so the one that exerts the pumping force to ensure that blood flows in the blood vessels. Now, why is the circulatory system important? Because it transports substances around the body. So which substances am I referring to? Number one, nutrients. Nutrients are glucose, amino acids, and so on. These are required by the body cells in order to carry out respiration. So respiration is a process whereby you're going to have cells break down food substances such as glucose in order to provide energy. And this energy is very important because it's the one that is required for cellular activities. Next, we have the respiratory gases. Now, whenever you come across this term, it simply refers to oxygen and carbon dioxide. So, oxygen is required by cells for respiration. So, you're going to have blood transporting oxygen to the body cells. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, is a waste product. It's produced during respiration. And being a waste product, it cannot be allowed to accumulate within the cells. Why? Because it's going to become poisonous. So it needs to be removed. So this is where the circulatory system comes in. Carbon dioxide diffuses into blood and is then transported to the organs of excretion, which in the case of this is the lungs. So these are just two examples of how the circulatory system is vital in mammals and the role it plays. Now, before I get into our next step of discussion, which is that of the structure of the heart, I want us to focus on these two types of blood. And this is something that you're going to come across a lot in this lesson of ours. Now, when it comes to blood, blood can either be oxygenated or deoxygenated, depending on the amount of oxygen it has. Oxygenated blood is blood that is rich in oxygen. This is blood that is coming from the lungs. So when blood reaches the lungs, you're going to have air diffusing into the blood from the alveoli. Remember, the lungs contain inhaled air that have a higher concentration of oxygen. Now, this is oxygenated blood. And where is it going to be taken to? To the body tissues and cells. Remember what he said? Oxygen is required by the cells to carry out respiration. So, oxygenated blood. It has a higher content of oxygen and a lower content of carbon dioxide. Deoxygenated blood, on the other hand, is simply the reverse of this. This is blood that still has oxygen but at a much lower concentration. Now, when it comes to blood, when blood moves around our body, what happens is that you're going to have oxygen diffusing from the blood into the body tissues, and you're going to be left with blood that has a lower concentration of oxygen but a higher concentration of carbon dioxide. Why? Because the carbon dioxide is a waste product which is going to diffuse from the body tissues and into the blood. And you end up having this blood having a higher amount of carbon dioxide but a lower content of oxygen. And this is what is termed as deoxygenated blood. So this is blood being transported from the body cells to, of course, the heart, so that it can then be taken to the lungs for oxygenation. Now, up to this point, I believe we are now ready to start with the heart. So what is the heart? The heart is a muscular organ that is at the center of the circulatory system. The function of the heart is that it pumps blood around the body, and it does so continuously 24/7 without stopping. When it stops, your time is up. So when it comes to the structure of the heart, I'm going to talk about the external structure first before proceeding to the internal structure. Now, what is the heart made of? So the heart is made up of these special muscles that are referred to as cardiac muscles. Whenever you hear this term cardiac muscles, know that it refers to the muscles that are found in the heart and nowhere else. These are characteristics that you're never going to find in any other type of muscle in our body. Number one, they can contract rhythmically without fatigue. In fact, they not only can, but they do so. So the heart muscles contract in order to generate enough force to pump blood across the body. And they do so without fatigue continuously. Do you know how amazing this is? Whenever we carry out any physical exercise, for a lot of us, what happens is that our muscles tire out after some time. Of course, it depends on your endurance, but for most of us, that is what happens. And that is okay, because when it comes to muscles, all the muscles in our body, with the exception of the cardiac muscles, are not meant to sustain long periods of contractions, with the exception of the cardiac muscles. Now, the second unique characteristic of the cardiac muscles is that they are myogenic. So this means that contraction of the heart muscles arises from within the heart and is not initiated by the nervous system. Okay, let's break that down. We have a nervous system in our body consisting of the brain, the spinal cord, and this network of nerve cells all around our body. Now, when the nervous system wants some muscle to contract to bring about movement, it sends a signal through the nerve cells. As you can clearly see here, the brain is sending a signal to the leg muscles to move, and this signal passes through the nerve cells. Now, this is what happens with most muscles in our body, except for the cardiac muscles. The contraction of the cardiac muscles is not initiated by the nervous system. It's initiated by the heart itself. So we have this special part of the heart that is located on the right atrium there. It's known as the pacemaker or the sinoatrial node. So the contractions arise from the pacemaker. They then proceed towards the septum, the muscular wall separating the right and left side of the heart, and then to the ventricles. And that is how contractions spread in our heart. Now, this ability is known as myogenic. So the contractions are not initiated by the nervous system, but by the heart itself. So those are the two unique characteristics of the cardiac muscles. Now, when it comes to cardiac muscles, these are muscles, of course, they're cells, and they're going to require a continuous supply of oxygen and nutrients to be supplied to them. Now, this is done by the coronary artery. So the coronary artery transports oxygenated blood rich in nutrients to the muscle cells. Coronary vein, on the other hand, transports deoxygenated blood from the cells. This is then transported to the right atrium and then to the lungs for oxygenation. So the coronary artery and the coronary vein. Now, let us proceed to the internal structure of the heart. So the heart itself is divided into two sections, one on the left side and the other on the right side. Now, if you look at our diagram, you're going to find that it's color coded. You have one section colored red and the other colored blue. Now, this is not by accident. When you have diagrams featuring the circulatory system or the heart, and you see red and blue, that is an indication of the type of blood that those parts come into contact with. So the red left side is the one that comes into contact with oxygenated blood. The right side comes into contact with deoxygenated blood. Now, if you have a challenge identifying which is the right side of the heart from the left, then I have a very easy solution for you. If you get such a question in your exams, just take the paper that you have, the paper with the diagram on it, have the diagram facing forwards and have the paper in front of your chest. So the right side of the diagram will equate to your right side too. The left side of the diagram will also be your left side, and as such. Now I have a very quick activity for you just to refresh ourselves and also to ensure that you have understood what we have discussed so far. Okay, moving on to the next bit, the septum. Now we're talking about the heart being divided into two parts, the left and right. This is done by the presence of a thick muscular wall known as the septum. So it's not essentially a wall, it's just a thick muscle that is placed at the center separating the two sides of the heart, right side and the left side. Now, when it comes to the septum, yes, it does separate these two parts, but for what reason? So as to prevent mixing of oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood. We cannot have these two mixing. Now, in case you're wondering, oh, what will be the problem with that? Because it's going to interfere with the gaseous exchange process in the lungs, and it's going to make the whole process become less efficient. So what is the outcome of this? You're going to have tissues receiving less oxygen than what they need. So as you can imagine, this is going to lead to less energy being produced through respiration, which is going to affect the cellular activities. So we cannot have this, and therefore the septum. Now the heart is divided into four chambers. Okay, so we have the upper chambers and the lower chambers. The upper chambers are known as the atria, plural. One is referred to as atrium. The lower chambers are known as the ventricles. Now, as you can see on each side of the heart, you're going to have one atrium and one ventricle as on the other side. Now, we're also going to have blood vessels connected to the heart. These are the main blood vessels that transport blood to and away from the heart. So, out of these four blood vessels, two are arteries and two are veins. So, the arteries are the pulmonary artery and the aorta. The veins are the vena cava and the pulmonary vein. So, these are the arteries and these are the veins. Now, one thing, I want you to look at each side of the heart, the left and right. So if we were to start with the left side, the oxygenated part, you're going to note that it's connected to one artery and one vein. So is the right side. Now when it comes to arteries, arteries usually transport oxygenated blood with the exception of the pulmonary artery. Veins, on the other hand, usually transport deoxygenated blood with the exception of pulmonary vein. So pulmonary vein transports oxygenated blood. Let's discuss where are these blood vessels transporting blood to and from. So starting with the vena cava. Now the vena cava transports blood from the body tissues back to the heart. So as you can imagine, this is going to be deoxygenated blood because most of the oxygen has been supplied to the body tissues. So this blood then passes into the right atrium, the right ventricle, and is then pumped out to the pulmonary artery where it's going to be transported to the lungs. Now once this blood has been oxygenated at the lungs, it's going to be transported back to the heart through the pulmonary vein. Okay, it cannot happen through the pulmonary artery because we do not want these two types of blood mixing. So the pulmonary vein transports blood from the lungs back to the heart, passes into the left atrium, left ventricle, and is then pumped out to the body tissues through the aorta. So a quick activity for you. I want you to look at the choices that you have, place them in their correct boxes. Now moving on to another structure of the heart, and these are the valves. So when it comes to how blood flows, we need it to always flow in the same direction, always. So for example, if blood is flowing from the vena cava into the right atrium and then into the right ventricle and then out through the pulmonary artery, we do not want it flowing backwards, okay? That will be a very big issue. So in order to prevent this, we have structures known as valves. So valves control the flow of blood. They ensure that blood only flows in one particular direction and never backwards. So over here, let's look at this. This is the right atrium. So you're going to have blood flowing from the right atrium into the right ventricles when the valves are open. And then the valves immediately close up to prevent the backflow of blood. So if we look at our diagram, you're going to note that we have 4 valves. So we have 2 valves separating the atria from the ventricles, and then 2 other valves are found at the base of the 2 arteries. So what are the names of these valves? Now, when it comes to the valves that are found between the atria and the ventricles, these are known as atrioventricular valves, okay, or cuspid valves, but each has its own specific name. So the cuspid valve that is found on the right side is known as the tricuspid valve. This is found between the right atrium and the right ventricle. The cuspid valve found on the left side is known as the bicuspid valve. It is found between the left atrium and the left ventricle. So these are the cuspid valves, and these are their locations between the atria and the ventricles. So the function of the cuspid valves is simply to prevent the backflow of blood from the ventricles into the auricles. So when the cuspid valves are open, what will happen is that you're going to have blood flowing from the atria into the ventricles. Now once that happens, the valves close to prevent the blood from flowing back into the atria. Now the other type of valves are the semilunar valves. These are found at the base of the arteries, at the base of the pulmonary artery and the aorta. So essentially what these do is they prevent the backflow of blood into the ventricles when the ventricles contract. Okay, let's pause there. So we are at this point. So the blood has flown from the auricles into the ventricles and the cuspid valves have closed up. So what happens is that the ventricles are then going to contract in order to push blood into the arteries so that it can be transported away from the heart. Now when this happens, the semilunar valves are going to be open. Now immediately this is done, the semilunar valves close up so that the blood does not flow back into the ventricles. There is one very important bit that I have forgotten to mention, and that is with regards to the muscular walls of the ventricles. So do you see these parts? These are made up of muscles. Now if you compare the muscular wall of the right ventricle to that of the left ventricle, you're going to note a difference. And this difference is that the muscular wall of the left ventricle is thicker than that of the right ventricle. Now the reason for this is because the left ventricle needs to contract forcefully to generate enough pressure in order to push blood into the aorta so that it can be transported to the rest of the body, which, as you can imagine, is quite a long distance. So it needs to generate enough force to do so. The right ventricle, on the other hand, simply needs to generate enough force to pump the blood a shorter distance, which is just to the lungs. And therefore, its muscular wall does not have to be as thick. By the way, this is also another clue that will help you identify which is the left side of the heart and which is the right. Just look for the thicker muscle, and it's going to be the left side. Okay, another quick activity for you. We are going to make this as fun and interactive as possible. I want you to identify the respective valves. See if you can remember them. Now, one other thing about the valves is that they are held in position by tendons. So tendons are connective tissue that are made up of protein fibers, and they're very tough. So these structures that you're seeing here are the tendons. So they hold the valves in position, preventing them from turning inside out. Up to this point, we are done with the structure of the heart. The next bit is with regards to circulation of blood in our body. So in mammals, we have double circulation, where you're going to have blood flowing into the heart twice in every complete circuit. Now, double circulation involves the following. pulmonary circulation and systemic circulation. So let's discuss these two. Now let's start with systemic circulation. In systemic circulation, you're going to have the heart pumping oxygenated blood to the body tissues. Of course, this is going to happen through the aorta. Now the next bit, deoxygenated blood from the body tissues is going to be transported back to the heart. So when the blood leaves the body tissues, it's going to have a lower concentration of oxygen and a higher concentration of carbon dioxide, and therefore it's said to be deoxygenated. This is going to be transported back to the heart through the vena cava, and this is systemic circulation, as simple as that. When it comes to pulmonary circulation, this involves the pulmonary vessels, the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary veins. So we're going to start here. Remember, deoxygenated blood has just been transported back to the heart. So this blood is then going to be pumped by the heart to the lungs through the pulmonary artery. Why is it being taken to the lungs? For oxygenation, of course. The next bit involves the pulmonary vein. So the pulmonary vein is going to transport oxygenated blood from the lungs back to the heart. And this is simply how circulation of blood occurs in our body. As simple as that. Now this brings us to the end of this lesson. But before I leave, I'm going to give you one final activity for you to do. So I want you to arrange the order of the blood's journey around the body. So these are the choices that you have. And the starting point is to be the left atrium. So start with the left atrium and proceed up to the end, whatever you decide it is. Let the color of the arrows guide you. If it's red, you're dealing with oxygenated blood. If it's blue, deoxygenated blood. And that brings us to the end of this lesson. I hope it was amazing for you as it was for me.